Hello and welcome to PressTV's debate. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. To withdraw or not to withdraw? This is the question being asked by many about the United States and whether it will live up to its commitments with the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. The U.S., along with other signatories, including Iran, signed the international agreement 2 years ago. But U.S. President Donald Trump has not certified Iran's compliance to the deal and has passed the buck on to Congress, who will vote on the U.S.'s commitment to the deal. Now stay with us as we take a look at what all of this could mean on this debate.
A storm of denunciation and criticism has showered upon the U.S. president for the kind language and sources he used and cited in his latest rhetoric against Iran. Angry reactions keep pouring in from across the globe. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani has strongly slammed Trump's anti-Iran statements, as well as his refusal to certify the landmark 2015 nuclear accord.
We respect the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action as a multilateral and international treaty as long as it protects our rights and interests. But Iran will not hesitate to respond if our interests are not served and parties to the deal move to violate their commitments.
Rouhani also hit back at his U.S. counterpart for accusing Iran of supporting terrorism in the region.
The IRGC, the Iranian nation, as well as Iraq, Syria, Yemen and other regional nations have confronted and will counter terrorist groups that, according to Trump during his election campaign, were created by the U.S. This will continue until the full elimination of the terrorists.
Rouhani rejected Trump's labeling our Islamic Revolution Guards Corps as corrupt, saying such a label suits the U.S. government and its armed forces for their continuous interventions in the region against nations' independence. Shortly after Trump's statement, the International Atomic Energy Agency reconfirmed that Tehran was fully abiding by its commitment under the nuclear agreement, also known as the JCPOA. Yukiya Amano noted that the nuclear watchdog has had access to all locations it needed to visit in Iran. The European Union Foreign Policy Chief, for her part, reminded the American president that it is not up to him or any single country to terminate the agreement.
It is not a bilateral agreement. It does not belong to any single country, and it is not up to any single country to terminate it. It is a multilateral agreement which was unanimously endorsed by the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2231.
Other signatories to the nuclear deal have also shared their concern over the U.S. president's stance on the accord. Russia said Trump's decision to decertify the deal would not have a direct impact on implementation of the agreement, but that it ran counter to its spirit. Britain, France and Germany also issued a joint statement warning the U.S. against taking decisions that could harm the nuclear deal. Trump's statements also made American politicians wonder whether the U.S. president had made any fact-checking before his speech. They described Trump's refusal to recertify the nuclear deal as a great mistake, saying it threatens the United States' own security.
President Trump's refusal to recertify is a grave mistake that threatens America's security and our credibility at a very critical time. The president is ignoring the overwhelming consensus of nuclear scientists, national security experts, generals, and his own cabinet. The president put forth some statements that are blatantly not true, and I'll depend on all of you to do the fact-checking on some of the statements that he made.
As widely expected, Trump's anti-Iran rhetoric has been warmly welcomed by Saudi Arabia and Israel. Trump threatened that his country will pull out of the agreement if Congress or U.S. allies do not modify it. Tehran has, however, said it would not bow to any such pressure, stressing that the landmark deal is not up to renegotiation. Now it remains to be seen whether Trump will back off from his decision or continues his path of withdrawing from international treaties and organizations.
I'd like to welcome to the program Professor, University of Tehran, Mr. Hamed Mousavi, and Security Studies Program, MIT, Mr. Jim Walsh out of Boston. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start this off in Boston. And Jim Walsh, what exactly has Trump done now? He hasn't actually canceled the deal, but he hasn't certified compliance either. So what does it mean in your perspective?
Well, it's a good question, and I think for viewers it can be a little confusing. We're really talking about two different but related things. On the one hand, there's the agreement itself, the JCPOA, and the UN Security Council resolution that endorses it. That's one thing. Then, after the agreement, or in the United States, the U.S. Congress passed its own law, a U.S. law, that requires that the president, this was passed back in 2015, that the president certify Iran's compliance. And it's the U.S. law that President Trump acted on by refusing certification. And now he's kicked it to Congress, as you said in your introduction, and we really don't know where that's going to go. It doesn't automatically nullify the JCPOA. It sort of depends on what Congress does. If they were to pass a bunch of new sanctions, which the legislation allows for following decertification, then that would obviously be a violation of the agreement. They may do nothing. You know, this is a Congress where it's very hard, whether it's health care or anything else, to get 51 votes. So I think right now we're in a period of uncertainty. There are lots of possibilities. Most of the possibilities are bad, but it doesn't automatically mean this agreement is over.
Okay, Mr. Mousavi, what exactly is the United States trying to do with this action? I mean, on the one hand, more sanctions have not been imposed yet, but sanctions against the Islamic Republic Guard Corps have been threatened. So, in your perspective, this side of things, exactly what does it mean?
Yes, so first of all, let me point out that this whole process of the executive branch reporting to Congress every 90 days, as Professor Walsh mentioned, is not part of the JCPOA. It's not part of the nuclear agreement. It's actually a compromise that was reached between the Obama administration and Congress at the time. Why am I emphasizing this? Because according to the nuclear deal, the only party that is responsible for declaring Iranian compliance is the IAEA. So, as you know, the IAEA has reported 8 times in the past 2 years that Iran has been fully compliant with the nuclear agreement. So, according to the nuclear deal, the United States is not in a position to even declare whether Iran is certified or not certified in terms of Iranian compliance. And this is something internal to the United States. So that's my first point. Regarding your question, I think what this does is it has created uncertainty regarding the fate of the nuclear deal. And what that does in effect is it minimizes the benefits for Iran, because when the nuclear deal is in jeopardy, when we don't know what the fate is, essentially what that does, it jeopardizes European investment and European trade with Iran. And I think that is exactly what Trump is trying to do. He is trying to have Iran comply with its with the propositions in the JCPOA that deal with Iran, but at the same time he wants to minimize the benefits Iran is receiving. Because if he actually wanted to scrap the deal, you know that Trump did not really need to decertify it and send it to Congress. He could have scrapped the deal just with a signature. As Obama had implemented the deal using an executive order, Trump could have scrapped it with an executive order as well. But that's not what he did. So essentially, they're keeping the JCPOA or the nuclear deal alive on the surface, while in reality, it's going into very uncharted territory and a lot of uncertainty.
Well, what about that, Jim Walsh, talking about the IAEA, as Mr. Mousavi has just mentioned, of course, the monitoring entity for the deal, as well as the majority of the Trump administration say that Iran is in compliance with the terms of the agreement. So is it that Trump does not believe in this international agency, or is it simply that he doesn't care what these entities say?
Well, you know, it's not my job, nor do I have the ability to read the mind of the president. I don't know. But you are right to say that the people working for him, his national security team, urged him not to do this. And in a phone call with reporters the night before the speech, Secretary Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and the National Security Advisor McMaster said that Iran was in compliance, in quote, technical compliance, which is just another word for compliance. Now, as a consequence, the president, I think, did not refuse certification based on Iran's compliance, but rather invoked another more vague principle, simply asserting that it was against America's national security interests. So the people around him are saying and have told him that Iran is abiding by its nuclear obligations. So he had to sort of search for another justification, and that's what he invoked. Let me say, if I may just add a little bit more, with respect to my colleague, Professor Mousavi, that I agree that absolutely that it adds uncertainty, and that one possible consequence of this uncertainty will be that businesses might be more reluctant to invest, and that is perhaps one objective of the agreement's opponents. But while I agree with that, I think it's premature to arrive at that as a conclusion. And the reason I say that is, people have been expecting him to decertify for about, since the last time he 90 days ago, when he started making remarks that he wasn't going to do it again. And yet, despite that, we have seen several European firms invest in Iran. We see a European financial firm buy a stake in I believe it was an Iranian bank. And so I think to some extent the investment community may go ahead and sort of, as they say, bake this into their calculation already. And there is talk that some European governments will indemnify companies so they are not at risk if something were to happen.
Well,
so
Jim Walsh, let me just jump in here. Sir, would you though say that, being that you've just admitted that perhaps could be a possible goal of this deal, would you say that then the United States is not keeping in spirit with the JCPOA? Of course, this is what Trump says about Iran, but do you admit to at least that part of it?
Well, number one, I personally don't have to admit to anything. I'm not a U.S. policy.
I'm asking you from your analytical perspective, sir.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Right. I can give you my analysis. Right.
Please.
That's not a matter of admitting things. So I would say that now I've lost the train of the question, but it's certainly possible that is a motivation. But it's hard for me to judge. Again, if most of the cabinet and all his national security team is telling him not to do it, and he does it anyway, it's not so much the U.S. government as it is one particular person who is pursuing this particular decision. So it's clearly divisions within the U.S. government on this question.
Well,
you asked me about the spirit. I'm sorry. I apologize. On the spirit thing, now, when Iranians have said this, I push back, and when Americans say it, I push back. There's no such thing in a document. There's no, section of the JCPOA that talks about the spirit. How do you measure spirit? Mm-hmm. No, these are legal documents, and the measurement should be the language in the documents. And so I know Iran has complaints about the U.S., and the spirit and vice versa. But I pay attention really to the actual language in the documents, and that's what we should focus on.
Well, then if that's the case, sir, isn't it definitely problematic what your president then is saying? Because, of course, he's the one that talks about the spirit. And based on this and other things, that's why he's basically wants to perhaps get out of the JCPOA. Isn't that then problematic? As you've just said, so you have a legal document, it is signed, and yet one man, as you've just said, because of the schisms in the government, one man can basically say null and void, and from his perspective, although it's not a bilateral agreement.
Yeah, well, that's the way the JCPOA is written. Basically, any of the signatories can go to the UN Security Council and accuse one of the other parties of being in material breach. And then that sets off a snapback sanctions process.
Okay, well, let me get Mr. Mousavi back in on this, sir. Sorry to interrupt you. Mr. Mousavi, what does that mean? You've heard Mr. Walsh just say that. So where's the IAEA in all of this? Because it's the IAEA supposed to be actually the entity that's saying yay or nay. And so far, it has said that Iran is adhering by its commitments. So what does all this mean?
So exactly. So according to the nuclear document, which the United States, by the way, signed during Obama, the only party responsible for certifying Iranian compliance is the IAEA, which of course has certified Iranian compliance 8 times. Nevertheless, this hasn't stopped the Trump administration from using baseless accusations, and also I would even argue that they have actually even fractured the actual letter of the JCPOA and not just its spirit. I'll give you an example. When the G20 summit was taking place in Hamburg in the summer, Donald Trump actually discouraged European leaders from investing in Iran. And this is not an accusation. This was actually mentioned by the White House spokesperson. So the US president discouraging Europeans from investing in Iran is actually non-compliance of the JCPOA by the United States. So it's actually not even the spirit. Even the letter is being harmed in regards to the Trump administration.
Now, Mr. Walsh, we look at some of the factual errors in Trump's speech. Now, he talks about ransom money or cash settlement given to Iran in plane loads of money. He fails to tell the American people that money actually belongs to the Iranians to begin with, that had been frozen. Why is that the case? Now, this is just one factual error. There were several factual errors in his speech yesterday.
Well, it's certainly not the first time the President of the United States has spoken and made factual errors. I mean, I think the Washington Post has documented that in the first, 9-10 months, there have been hundreds of misstated facts. So I'm not really surprised by that. Again, you're asking me to sort of interpret and read the mind of the president. I don't think anyone can do that. Maybe his closest staff, but certainly I can't do that.
Will he be held responsible? Okay, of course, you cannot read his mind. But I want to talk about the American people, actually. So when factual errors, as you said, that the Washington Post has documented many of this president this year, so he's not held responsible. He can say whatever he wants, but being that he is the leader of the United States and the ramifications and repercussions from some of his words, where's responsibility?
Well, I mean, I certainly have disagreed with the statements, and people point out when he makes errors, but it's not like you can. There's a law that says you can kick out a president if he or she says wrongful statements or has bad policies. We have a democratic system. He was elected. Voters will get another chance in 4 years, and certainly in another year or so to elect new members of Congress. But he'll be up for re-election, and he will be held accountable there. If he doesn't violate a law, then it's the electoral process that functions with accountability in a democratic system.
Mr. Mousavi, your perspective, what do you think the bottom line is? What exactly is the problem, do you think, that President Trump has with Iran? Obviously, he has the information that Iran has not violated the agreement. So is it because the Islamic Republic is an independent country and want to support others trying to seek independence from oppressed? Or what is it exactly you think that is the root of the problem here and such animosity coming out of Washington?
First of all, these factual errors, I don't think they are mistakes. They are said on purpose. When Donald Trump comes out and says that Iran got more than $1 billion in cash, and he doesn't mention that this was Iranian money that was frozen to begin with, he omits that portion of the information on purpose. And this is not the first time. This is something that he repeatedly said during the campaign in order to essentially trash the nuclear agreement. I'll give you another example. In his speech yesterday, he called the Persian Gulf the Arab Gulf, whereas in reality, even in the United States, I mean, throughout history, the name has been the Persian Gulf. Even the Gulf War of 1990-1991, led by the United States, is called the Persian Gulf War. When I visited Arlington Cemetery, on the tombstones of the soldiers who had died, it said, died in the Persian Gulf War. Nevertheless, yesterday, that's not the word he used. And I don't think it was a mistake. It was done on purpose. And why would it be done on purpose? Because this administration in Washington is heavily influenced by the Israelis and the Saudis. You know that the only two entities that have come in support of Trump's speech yesterday has been the Israelis and the Saudis. And Donald Trump has cuddled up with the Saudis. I mean, usually in the American system, it's tradition, it's not forced, but usually, traditionally, the first trip of the president is either to Canada or Mexico, usually to Canada. Nevertheless, Donald Trump used his first opportunity of a foreign trip to visit the most despotic regime within the Middle East. So I think we're seeing a lot of the hidden agenda of the Israelis as well as the Saudis, and I think this is heavily influencing Trump's foreign policy.
And 30 seconds, both of you, please. First, Jim Walsh, where do you see this going? Possibilities?
Well, I think, unfortunately, as my colleague said, there's such great uncertainty and any number of possibilities. This could all just blow over. Congress won't be able to muster the votes to pass new legislation, and then it's just a matter of, sort of waiting this out to see what happens. On the other hand, he could kill the agreement, and that could lead to a series of events that results in war. So I think, unfortunately, as I said, there are many possibilities. Almost all of them are bad. Not all of them, but almost all of them. And it's wide-ranging. And at this point, we just don't know.
All right, Mr. Mousavi, your take, same question.
I think the most probable outcome is I don't think there is enough support within, especially in the Senate, to kill the deal and reimpose nuclear sanctions. Nevertheless, I think a compromise that will be reached is that they will implement so-called non-nuclear sanctions in order to keep the deal, but sanction Iran at the same time. So I think that is the most probable outcome.
And thank you both. That brings us to the end of the program. Appreciate you both being with us. Professor, University of Tehran, Hamid Mousavi, right here in the studio, and Security Studies Program Professor from MIT, Jim Walsh, out of Boston. And viewers, as always, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marzieh Hashemi signing out. Make sure you join us right here, same place, same time, tomorrow. Goodbye.